Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. And welcome back, everyone, to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am, of course, Michael, your host, and we have something a little more radical today, a clip from a doctor who is critical of the mRNA vaccines. He's saying that we need to be careful about using RNA because of the cellular structure, our human cellular structure, that we don't know in the long term what other types of conditions that these could cause, because we could be affecting how proteins and are seen in what normal behavior of proteins could be seen, because we have affected the proteins inside of the cells with the mRNA vaccines. So he's very critical of it. He's especially critical of the use of such vaccines in children because of them being in such early development stages, and cellular structures are still learning and figuring things out. So we do have a recording from him about from this doctor about the potential dangers of the mRNA vaccines, and especially with children. So it is a little more radical because mainstream is saying that there is nothing wrong with using the mRNA vaccines, and the issue he brings up is down the road, what are we going to be looking at in our society as far as things like cancers and other types of chronic and critical conditions. So we also are going to hear from Dr. Etienne, and she wants us to look more closely at how we're investing in healthcare, not just here in Canada and the U.S., but all over the Americas, both North and South America, and all the countries, and making sure that we're doing things in an equitable fashion. A bit of quote here. Chronic underinvestment has made Americans vulnerable to COVID-19. She said this in her media briefing. We're going to hear that in a second. Few countries invest in public spending in their health services as they should, leaving them prone in shortages in health personnel and essential supplies. And she goes on to say that the pandemic has actually amplified this, and we need to take a closer look at it, and we need to ensure that our governments are actually taking a closer look at that. So that coming from the PAHO, the latest PAHO press briefing. So, and we're also going to hear from the WHO, of course, with Dr. Tedros, and he's calling for, of course, for more vaccinations by the end of the year, and again, they're talking about making sure that this is being equitable. The call was made by the WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus at a meeting with foreign ministers hosted by the United States. Nearly 80 countries and half of them in Africa will not reach a vaccination goal of 40% without help. And to reach that target, we need an additional 550 million doses is what he's calling for, and he's talking about making sure that these doses are available through COVAX, and which is the global vaccine bank that was created especially for COVID-19. So let's listen to the segments, and we'll be back at the end. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Thank you, Tariq, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. 22 months since the first case of COVID-19 were reported, and almost a year since the first vaccines were approved, reported cases and deaths from COVID-19 are increasing again. More than 5 million deaths have now been reported, and we know the real number is higher. We're still losing more than 50,000 of our sisters and brothers every week. Last week, 56 countries from all regions reported an increase in deaths from COVID-19 of more than 10%. We hear reports from many countries about lack of ICU beds, lack of supplies, overwhelmed health workers, and hospitals deferring other needed procedures. Let me be very clear. This should not be happening. We have all the tools to prevent transmission and save lives, and we continue to call on all countries to use those tools. Yesterday, we added another new tool with the emergency use listing of COVAX, the AIDS vaccine to receive WHO validation for safety, efficacy, and quality. Emergency use listing contributes to vaccine equity by enabling countries to expedite their own regulatory approval to import and roll out vaccines. We encourage all vaccine manufacturers who have not yet received emergency use listing to contact WHO to discuss how to accelerate the process through rolling submissions. We continue to call on manufacturers of vaccines that already have WHO emergency use listing to prioritize COVAX, not shareholder profit. We continue to hear excuses about why low-income countries have only received 0.4% of the world's vaccines. One is that low-income countries can't absorb vaccines. That's not true. With the exception of a few fragile, conflict-affected, and vulnerable countries, most low-income countries are ready to go. The problem is simply that they cannot get the vaccines. I repeat, they cannot get the vaccines. Another excuse from manufacturers is that low-income countries have not placed orders for vaccines. Most low-income countries are relying on COVAX, which has the money and the contracts to buy vaccines on their behalf, but manufacturers have not played their part. We still don't know when the manufacturers will deliver. We continue to call on all manufacturers to prioritize their contracts with COVAX and the Africa Vaccines Acquisition Trust, or AVAT. No more vaccines should go to countries that have already vaccinated more than 40% of their population until COVAX has the vaccines it needs to help other countries get there too. No more boosters should be administered except to immunocompromised people. Most countries with high vaccine coverage continue to ignore our call for a global moratorium on boosters at the expense of health workers and vulnerable groups in low-income countries who are still waiting for the first dose. We cannot end the pandemic without vaccines, but vaccines alone will not end the pandemic. Vaccines do not replace the need for public health and social measures. They complement them. Physical distancing, avoiding crowded spaces, masks, ventilation, hand hygiene, and other effective public health measures remain important in every country. Every country must continue to adjust and adapt its strategy. To support countries to do that, WHO has developed a tool called the Interaction Review, which countries can use to evaluate what's working and what's not. More than 100 interaction reviews have now been conducted by 68 countries. Several countries have conducted multiple reviews, including South Africa, which has done 10, making it a central component of its response. Several key lessons emerge from these reviews: the need for strong and active national leadership at the highest levels, flexibility and adaptability by adjusting and repurposing existing systems, guidelines, and resources, multi-sectoral cooperation, and, in the case of vaccine rollout, the need for adequate cold chain capacity and real-time monitoring of vaccine stock. Ending the pandemic as rapidly as possible must remain the central focus for every country. At the same time, we owe it to those who have lost their lives to this virus to learn the lessons it's teaching us and take whatever action is necessary to prevent a future disaster on this scale. The world was not prepared for COVID-19, and we knew we were not prepared. In 2018, WHO and the World Bank formed the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, the GPMB, an independent panel of experts to identify gaps in the world's defenses and make recommendations on how to close them. We did not know then when the next global crisis would arise or what it would be, but we knew that disease X would come eventually. The GPMB published its first report in September 2019, just months before the pandemic hit. It identified many of the vulnerabilities that COVID-19 has exposed and exploited: the lack of political leadership and commitment, the lack of health system readiness, the lack of trust with communities, and the lack of international cooperation. The second GPMB report, released in the middle of the pandemic last year, incorporated hard-won insights with calls for predictable and sustained financing, equitable access for vaccines and other life-saving tools, and global governance for preparedness. The GPMB published its third report last week. Instead of making more recommendations, the GPMB is calling the world to act on the recommendations it has already made, which are more relevant now than before the pandemic, but on which there remains little action. We have no shortage of reports, reviews, and recommendations, but we have a shortage of action. It's clear what needs to happen: better governance for global health security, including a binding treaty on pandemic preparedness and response, better financing to strengthen the capacities of all countries, especially the most vulnerable, better systems and tools to prepare for, prevent, detect, and respond rapidly to outbreaks with epidemic or pandemic potential, and a strengthened, empowered, and sustainably financed WHO at the center of the global health architecture. To say more about its latest report, I'm delighted to welcome my friend and brother, Mr. El-Haj Assi, the GPMB co-chair and the former Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Assi, thank you for your leadership, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my brother. I think I could build on one of the very powerful sentences that you just used. We need action. We already know what we need to do. What we need is action, and action now. Action now, because the window of opportunity is closing by the day. So we need that urgency, and we need ambition. You were absolutely right. Report after report, what we predicted happened. And we were congratulated to be right. And those were moments where it is not nice to be right. What is it, that we know what's going to happen and we're smart enough to predict it and not smart enough to take the action required from preventing the outbreaks from becoming pandemics, from preventing shock, to become disasters. You mentioned the numbers. 17 million COVID-related deaths. Millions of people have lost their lives. Millions more are without parents or grandparents. Well, to put it like we feel in the region I am now, let me just say bluntly, it is deeply shameful. We should grieve. We should be angry, because millions of deaths is neither normal nor acceptable. And these are just numbers that we're quoting, and we forget that behind each unit of these numbers, there is a face, there is a human being, there is a story of a parent, of a child, of a friend, of a colleague, many of them, so we have lost ourselves, being on the front line and trying to respond to this challenge. The rift between haves and the have-nots is growing. And you're right, it's not just vaccine equity that should be front and center. It is also a matter of how low-income countries are able to implement public health measures within their communities and fragile economies to keep people safe. We are indeed facing extraordinary challenges, and the world is clamoring for solutions. Yet global leadership continues to step back and shy away from what needs to be done. We've seen it happen once again with the recent G20 leader statement. Honestly, we had hoped for firm financial commitments to fully fund global efforts to curb the pandemic. We had hoped for an agreement to establish a financing mechanism that would provide predictable financing at the scale required to prevent future pandemics. But what we got was a commitment to keep talking about it. We shouldn't be surprised. The world has exposed the world, that is COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the world that is unequal, divided, in many instances unaccountable. Through the pandemic, polarization, geopolitical conflicts, nationalism, and skepticism of multilateralism have meant that many countries are raising the drawbridge rather than seeking global solutions. We shouldn't be surprised, but we should be dismayed. And we must demand more. We need to see signs that political leaders are willing to work together, all political leaders, and take the bold steps that are urgently needed to protect the one and only planet we share, as well as the one and only humanity we share. In our report, we have challenged world leaders to take 5 steps, only 5, that would demonstrate their commitments to change and how they will go about it urgently, inclusively, and equitably. 5 simple steps over the next 8 weeks that will give a clear signal to the world that they agree on what needs to be done and are very serious about doing it. Let me spell them out. First, agree at the November 2021 special session of the World Health Assembly on the need to adopt an international agreement on pandemic preparedness and response and establish a process for taking forward negotiations. Second, agree to convene a summit of heads of states and government on pandemic preparedness and response together with other stakeholders and set in motion a preparatory process for this summit. And I emphasize here, together with other stakeholders, because we've been experiencing a multidimensional problem that will require a multi-sectoral approach and solution. Third, agree to significant increase in WHO assessed contributions in order to adequately and sustainably finance the organization's essential functions and core capacities. Year in and year out, WHO has been weakened by less financing, less authority, yet if things are not working, the fingers are being pointed towards WHO. That has to change. Fourth, agree to establish a new financial intermediary fund for pandemic preparedness and response. And finally, develop terms of reference for the design of an end-to-end mechanism for research, development, and equitable access to common goods. Is there a hope? Yes. After years of inaction, we are finally seeing some traction on climate change. World leaders gathered in Glasgow this week at COP26 are taking political responsibility and making commitments for change. The current political context is challenging, but there are some signs of progress. Pandemic preparedness and response should be a simpler problem in comparison. So, why is it so difficult to get world leaders in a room to agree on the bold solutions required? If COVID-19 is not the catalyst for change, what will it be? It is easy to be cynical today and think that nothing can change, that we are forever condemned to repeat the cycle of panic, apathy, and neglect. But we must reject pessimism and recognize our common humanity and growing interdependence. We must recognize that we live in a shared world with shared risk and shared responsibilities. The solutions must match the magnitude of need to bring this pandemic to an end and to prepare for the next one, and even better prepare for the next one. And we must support those individuals and organizations working tirelessly to end this epidemic. Many of them, or some of the most important of them gathered in this room today. We're indebted to you, my brother, Dr. Tedros, and to the WHO for the leadership you continue to show in working towards a global health ecosystem that serves everyone, everywhere. And that is the spirit, in which, this report, has been published. And more than a report, it should be incentivizing action. And we continue our mobilizations in the frame of an independent framework to see things happening, action be taken, and accountability be shown. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my brother Asi. I will quote you from what you said. If COVID is not the catalyst for change, what could it be? That's really true. And thank you for your clear call to action. And we can only hope that the international community acts on that call. As you said, we know what needs to happen. What we need now is action, urgency, and ambition. Thank you so much again for your leadership.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Recording in progress.
QIA, Q&A en inglés. Hoy, la directora de la OPS,
The director of PAHO, Dr. Carissa Etienne, will be talking about the situation of COVID-19 in the Americas, and she will also talk about the importance of strengthening health systems in the region. With Dr. Etienne Barbosa, Assistant Director of PAHO, Dr. Ciro Ugarte, Director of the Department of Health Emergencies, and Dr. Sylvain Aldigueri, Incident Manager for in PAHO 2. I invite Dr. Etienne now to share her opening remarks and giving us the welcome
Good
remarks.
morning. Let me thank you for joining today's press briefing. And today I'm speaking to you from Dominica, my homeland, a tiny island. After 2 consecutive months of decline, COVID infections are increasing in some countries in the Americas. Over the last week, 700,000 new cases and 13,000 COVID-related deaths were reported in our region. We are seeing jumps in cases in parts of Colombia and Bolivia. In the southern cone countries, we've seen an upward trend after public health measures were relaxed. In the Caribbean, while Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico have reported decreases in new infections, cases are rising in the Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados. The Cayman Islands and Dominica are also experiencing a high number of cases. The good news is that vaccinations continue to pick up in our region. Some 48% of people in Latin America and the Caribbean have been fully immunized against COVID. But coverage is still much lower in some countries and territories. In Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Guatemala, less than 1 in 5 people have been vaccinated and protected. In Nicaragua, coverage remains in the single digits, and in Haiti, less than 1% of people have been fully vaccinated. This inequity must be addressed. PAHO is committed to helping countries in our region secure the vaccines that they need to protect their people. Through donations via COVAX and through direct procurement. We are already working with manufacturers to secure additional doses on behalf of our region. PAHO has signed supply agreements with 3 manufacturers who have WHO emergency use listed vaccines, and it is in final negotiation with a 4th supplier, an mRNA vaccine producer. We are doing this to expand vaccine options for our countries in 2021 and certainly 2022. We invite our member states to join the initiative using the revolving fund, our established and proven mechanism for equitable access to vaccine supplies, guided by evidence-based recommendations. With an eye on the future, we are working directly with public institutions and private companies in Argentina and Brazil to strengthen their capacity to develop and produce COVID mRNA vaccines in our region that will benefit all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a strategic and long-term project to reduce our vulnerability and dependence by establishing regional capacity for this innovative technology. In the future, this can also help us combat other viral diseases of importance in the region. And we have partnered with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, to analyze our region's manufacturing potential, and with the hope of strengthening our role at every step of the supply chain to reduce our reliance on pharmaceutical imports. But for now, too many people
Thank you for
in our
listening to
region
Depictions
remain
Media
vulnerable
Radio.
and do not have access to the vaccines that they need. Over the last year and a half, we have seen how the health of our populations, the state of our economies, and the well-being of our security and society are interconnected. And that's why today I want to talk about the importance of resilient health systems that can help our economies and our societies recover from this pandemic. Health systems have been weakened by the pandemic. As countries worked to quickly build the ICU bed capacity and ramp up hospital services to care for COVID patients, other essential health services suffered. More than half of countries in our region reported disruptions to mental health services and routine immunization programs. Reproductive health services, nutrition, care, and support for managing chronic conditions were interrupted in more than 40% of countries. These services have one thing in common. They are offered at the first level of care. Primary care, as you've heard us say over and over again, primary care is the backbone of our health systems. Strong primary care services can meet most people's health needs close to the communities that they serve. It is also at the primary healthcare level that prevention takes a big focus. So when countries deprioritize these services, they leave patients with fewer of the services and care that they need to stay healthy. And that's why building more resilient health systems should start here at the first level of care. And this is especially true during a pandemic, as it is at the primary care level that COVID testing, contact tracking, and tracing and immunizations take place. It is essential to bring more people into the system and to improve access for all, because even before the pandemic, nearly 30% of people in our region could not access health services because of who they are, where they live, or because the cost was simply too high. To address these inequities, countries must prioritize public investments in their health systems to leave no one behind. Chronic underinvestment has made the Americas vulnerable to COVID-19. Few countries invest as much public spending in their health systems as they should, leaving them prone to shortages in health personnel and essential supplies, as well as crumbling infrastructure and underfunded essential public health functions. But we've seen throughout this pandemic that countries can increase public spending on health. Public investments in health during the pandemic increased in many countries to improve health service capacities for COVID-19, to maintain essential health services, and to deploy COVID-19 vaccines. Many governments obtained support for new loans or reprogrammed existing loans from international financial institutions. Several countries are moving forward with special allocations and programs to reinforce health services at the primary care level. Chile, for example, had the highest increase in primary care spending in 15 years. Uruguay approved extending national health insurance to workers that lost their jobs. Peru posted a 13% increase in the health budget to prioritize primary care. Bolivia has pledged that 10% of public expenditure would go to health over 5 years. But this cannot be a short-term trend. All countries should increase public expenditures to the recommended 6% of GDP or higher in their health systems. And they should ensure that 30% of this funding goes to the first level of care. Increased public investments were key during the pandemic and will be so after it recedes. Financial institutions are making additional loans available, and donors are pledging their support, so there's never been a better time for countries to take advantage of these resources to maximize their public investments in health. But it's not just about spending more. It's about spending smart. That is why governance is key. Our health systems should be properly managed and guided by evidence to ensure that they are effective and can keep us safe. We also need greater dialogue between health, finance institutions, industry, industrial partners, and as well as civil society. So decisions affecting our health systems reflect the expertise of our health authorities, and that health policies are transparent, harmonized, and efficient. Insufficient public investments in health threaten our ability to recover from this pandemic and could have ripple effects for years to come. As economies remain strained, countries face choices about how to spend limited funds, and these are tough choices. But we cannot forget that health is an investment, not an expense. As we learned with COVID-19, health is at the core of vibrant societies. It keeps people working, it keeps kids in school, and companies productive, and economies growing. Without it, we are more vulnerable to economic and political instability. Now more than ever, we must rebuild with the vision of health for all as our guide. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Etienne, for the update and the strong words. Pasamos ahora a las preguntas que
Now we go to the questions that have been sent by email and those that we are receiving through the Q&A button. Remember to please give us your name and your outlet when you send your questions. We begin with one question from Blanca Valadez from Milenio, Mexico. It is about the COVID sequelae among survivors. What conditions are you seeing and which require more attention? Dr. Aldeguerri, thank you very much for your question. And then 3 months later, they begin to have symptoms which last at least 2 months, and symptoms that cannot be explained otherwise with an alternative diagnosis. Common symptoms include fatigue, breathing difficulty, cognitive dysfunction, but other symptoms as well, which impact daily functioning for daily life. Symptoms can also fluctuate over time. Patients with persistent symptoms which alter their daily life will experience limitations in self-care, in mobility, and in going back to work, among others. Managing post-COVID-19 condition requires a multidisciplinary approach based on evidence, which is comprehensive and centered around the patient. The implications for health services will be significant, and the cost of managing these patients will depend on their need for care, as well the need for specialized rehabilitation, and certainly this for a long period of time. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see all of you here today. So I'd like to start off with some good news. I just got here from Alberta, and I was in Olds, Alberta, doing a speech, and I found out some good news. So you all have heard about the 2 patients who were in their 70s who recovered from COVID after they got ivermectin. And then everyone was kind of in the dark of what happened to the 3rd patient who was in her mid-90s. Well, I just got news this week from Alberta that she made it out of the hospital as well. She's back in her usual nursing home, so that makes it 3 out of 3 who made it out of hospital because of ivermectin. So I heard while I was away, the day before yesterday, Bonnie Henry had some kind of a press conference, and during the press conference, a reporter asked her what she was going to do about taking away the license of doctors who write vaccine exemptions. I haven't seen that actual press conference. Is it true? Did some reporter ask that? Oh, wow. So, someone needs to get me the name of that reporter and what journalism school he or she graduated from. Because you know what? I need to talk to the dean of that university. They shouldn't be graduating people from journalism school until they start to learn how to ask questions. Because she could have emailed me, she could have phoned me, and she could have asked me why I was writing vaccine exemptions. Because I would have told her. I write vaccine exemptions for cancer. Anyone in your family has a history of cancer, I'll write you a vaccine exemption. Nobody knows how much cancer this new injection will cause. Because it takes 20 years to find out any new drug, any new therapy. It takes 20 years to find out how much cancer it will cause. And then, I know there's some pseudoscientists who claim they know the science, who will say, well, I can't prove that it doesn't cause cancer. But let me talk to you about theoretical science, because I did microbiology and physiology at McGill. So, if any of you are listening, all these pseudoscientists who think this vaccine is safe, let me educate you on microbiology and cell biology. So in the human genome, there are retrotransposons, and retrotransposons contain endogenous reverse transcriptase. That means anything that's mRNA or RNA, if it gets inside one of your cells, it's just a matter of luck whether or not that cell reverse transcribes that mRNA back into DNA. I will repeat. Every cell in the body has retrotransposons. Every retrotransposon encodes a protein called reverse transcriptase. This is not the reverse transcriptase that's a part of HIV. This is human reverse transcriptase. So anyone who tells you that mRNA cannot change your DNA is absolutely wrong. So the worst part of this is human endogenous reverse transcriptase is most active during embryogenesis, when you're still a fetus. And then it gradually decreases in activity as your development through embryogenesis, birth, infancy, childhood, teenage years. So the people most at risk of DNA changes from an mRNA vaccine are people who are still developing. Then that's children. Children are most at risk for genetic DNA changes from an mRNA vaccine because children have more endogenous human reverse transcriptase activity than fully grown adults because they're still growing. The other mechanism of cancer that can be caused, especially when you give children an mRNA vaccine, is immune lack of specificity. Because this mRNA vaccine is telling cells to produce a non-human protein, the spike protein. Why on earth are you giving children whose immune systems are still developing and learning to tell the difference between good cells in the body and bad cells in the body? Why are you telling the cells inside a child's body to produce a non-human protein? And what that will do from a basic immunology point of view, and I am really, really upset at the number of doctors and immunologist specialists who should know what I'm talking about, who are not speaking up. I have a message for those immunologists and pediatric specialists. You better listen and you better remember all the stuff you learned in medical school, because this is why you were taught that. During development, during childhood, the body's immune system has to differentiate between normal cells that are supposed to be present in the body and abnormal cells. If you give the child's body, the cells in that child's body, an abnormal protein and tell those cells to start manufacturing toxic, non-human spike proteins, then there's a good chance that that child's immune system, which is still developing, might say, oh, there's nothing wrong with the body's own cells producing non-human proteins. And so what that will do is 10 years, 20 years, maybe even 30 years later, when eventually through living, sometimes hard work, stress, being exposed to chemicals, when one of those child cells mutates, and what the immune system should do is recognize the mutated cells that, that hasn't had a healthy diet, or maybe that cell ate too much McDonald's or something, it should eliminate that cell because it's not producing normal proteins. But if 20 years earlier that child got a spike protein vaccination, that immune system might not be able to recognize the cancerous cell anymore, because that immune system got used to seeing normal cells produce abnormal proteins. So that increases the risk of cancer. So now we're at two reasons why mRNA injections can cause cancer, especially when given to children. One is retrotransposons and reverse transcriptase. The second is Immune lack of specificity. Just when a child's immune system should be learning how to make the fine differentiation between cancerous and non-cancerous, you're poisoning that child's immune system with an abnormal, non-human spike protein. But wait, there's a third reason why these injections might cause cancer, especially in children. Children's bodies, the cells in their bodies, should only be making proteins for growth and regular daily cell activities. So when you give cells of the body instructions to produce abnormal proteins, those cells are not producing the normal growth proteins and normal daily activity proteins. One of the most important cells in the body for both adults and children is a class of proteins called heat shock proteins. If you drink too much alcohol, don't get enough sleep, too cold, too hot, exposed to toxic substances, the cells of the body create heat shock protein, and that enables the cell to survive chemicals, heat stress, toxic stresses. If the cells of your body are busy producing spike proteins instead of heat shock proteins, which also have anti-cancer properties, they prevent DNA damage. If the cells are busy producing spike proteins, they're not producing the cell's own proteins that the cell uses to protect itself against toxins, stress, and DNA damage. So that's a third reason why spike proteins will increase your chances of cancer. If you don't think there's evidence for out there already for this, one of the advisories when Russia released its own coronavirus vaccine was anyone who took the vaccine should not drink alcohol for 2 weeks. And that's a big problem because that means whatever was in their coronavirus vaccine caused enough metabolic stress that if someone drank alcohol within 2 weeks of their vaccine, they would be causing serious damage to their bodies. And that's only in 2 weeks. We're not even looking at 20 years yet. So the biggest possible crime I can imagine right now, here today, is trying to give this mRNA injection to children. There's 3 molecular and cellular biology reasons not to. And every single one of those 3 reasons increases the chances of cancer. So if this reporter's listening, phone me, send me an email. I will give you an interview and educate you about cancer and this injection. No one should be forced to take something where the cancer risk is unknown that doesn't even work. And I know the College of Physicians and Surgeons, Vancouver Coastal Health, and Bonnie Henry will get out there and say the vaccine works. Well, it doesn't. If a vaccine worked, you wouldn't need a vaccine passport. If this worked, there wouldn't be a 4th wave. Should I talk more about molecular biology? Because I'd love to. So, the stupidest idea you could possibly have for a vaccine is to make a vaccine against just one protein on the surface of a virus. That is the worst, stupidest microbiological idea ever. Because if it's just one protein, the virus is like, hey, I'm going to change the color of my socks, I'm going to change that one protein, and then, hey, I'm back in business. Now, natural immunity, when you have antibodies to the entire virus, to all the different parts of the virus, it's very difficult for a virus to avoid natural immunity. That's why you never ever heard about variants of the influenza being a problem. It's always a different strain next year that's completely different from the strain that was in previous years. That's because natural immunity has multiple different antibodies to multiple different parts of the virus. So for a virus to change and defeat the antibodies, it has to change everything about itself. So from the get-go, this whole idea that making a spike protein to stimulate an antibody to just one part of the virus, it's doomed to failure. They need to stop it. The scientists need to stop claiming that this vaccine works, because it doesn't. The proof is in the numbers. The proof is in the theory. So I hope they're listening. And if they want to come debate me, send me an email. I would love to have a debate with any scientist that wants to challenge me on anything I've spoken about today. Thank you very much for listening. My email is dnagase@protonmail.com. I'll take a couple questions. Anyone have a quick question? Yes. Absolutely. So the question was, should you be exempt if you already have antibodies? Absolutely. That is way better than a vaccine. And in fact, some of the latest research shows that people who are already immune because they had a natural coronavirus infection, if they get the vaccine, their immunity, their natural immunity actually gets decreased. Yeah, another question here.
You mentioned about having family history of cancer. How can we get an exemption from you or another doctor for that reason?
Send me an email to dnagase@protonmail.com, and then I'll collect basic information about you, family history, past medical history, and we'll have a phone visit, and then we'll go from there. Okay.
Okay, so we listened to all the segments today, and some countries do need financial help. They need help actually maintaining supplies and ensuring that they have enough workers to administer vaccines, to administer care, and so forth. And when we live in a country like we do here in either the U.S. or Canada, which most of you are from who are listening to me right now, we have that in abundance. So I want you to picture a country where a child dies of food poisoning, and it isn't that situation isn't exactly an undeveloped country as we might have here, because that is a situation that happened in South Africa, which is not exactly an underdeveloped country. It's just not completely industrialized country. It still has remote areas to it that are hard to get to by way of medical attention. Here in Canada and the U.S., there are communities that are hard to reach for medical attention. Not quite as extreme as an example in South Africa, where a child died of food poisoning, but where the conditions that if you're closer to a city center, you can be treated very quickly and maybe even sent home right away. Whereas if you're in a more remote area where you have to be choppered out or flown out to a hospital where you can actually receive treatment. Such as in a case in Alberta where woman had a heart attack, and she couldn't be treated at the hospital that was nearby her, so she had to be airlifted to a cardiac center in a larger city area. So remoteness and putting money into healthcare systems to ensure that people can live well is a real problem. Okay, so let's move on to science. Science, basically the word itself, means to study. It means to question. And what we do need to see happen at this point in a pandemic is, yes, as the general public, we have the right and we should be questioning everything that is released. We should not just take things for face value. We should be questioning all of those who are in authority so that we understand exactly what is happening. We have that right. Don't treat it like it is a privilege. It is a right to be able to ask those questions, to ask what the long-term effects of something are going to be, to ask what is going to happen to our society 20 years from now because we use certain technologies. Go ahead and ask the questions and make sure that you understand the answers. Make them explain it to you until you understand what is actually going on before you make up your mind. Do not just take it. Take what is offered to you at face value. Question it and question it until you understand, until you have finally made up your mind, not the authority making up your mind. You have the right to stand against the mandates if you don't believe those mandates are accurate. You have the right to stand for what you believe to be true. So do so, voice your opinion, and thank you for listening today to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio, and I have been your host, Michael Clogs. Thank you for listening today, and thank you for supporting us with our sponsors. Please go to depictions.media for more information, and click on our contact link and let us know how we can help. How we can help bring your story and help bring us to a better world. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.